due to our audience here a little bit more, and we'll be talking a little bit more about how we can embed mocking into your Katalon test suites to solve those dependency headaches that we often have. So before I get into that, just a little bit about myself. Again, my name's Dan Perovich. I consider myself an integration enthusiast, but I'm really a solution engineer. I lead our solution engineering team and our customer success team at WireMock. And when I'm not working, I'm traveling with my family, doing something DIY or playing around with home automation, which you can imagine to keep the family happy. I'm constantly testing all of those interactions and how things work together in the house. So just a little bit about how we'll spend the next 30 minutes together. I'll give a brief overview on WireMock, call that WireMock 101, just to introduce everybody to what WireMock is and some of its history. And then we'll talk about solving the ever-growing third-party dependencies that we have, not only in development, but especially in testing, as we incorporate more and more external factors into our systems under test. And then I'll showcase with a live demo how we can do this with Katalon and WireMock working together. And there's various ways to do that. And given any time left, we'll answer any questions that came in during the session or come in at the end. So first and foremost, WireMock 101. What is it? WireMock started as an open source tool back in 2011. It was really geared towards the Java community and was a test library that was often embedded in your unit tests, where you would very quickly spin up a little WireMock instance, provision some requests and responses to it, and then execute your tests against it. Of course, there was a CLI to it, but it really stayed in the developer community, right? And often was just used inside of your unit test code. And developers were using this, right, to create stable environments. They didn't have all the pieces and parts, and they wanted to isolate themselves from flaky third parties. Now, those third parties could be internal. A lot of times they're external. And oftentimes they were also using it to simulate the APIs that didn't exist yet, right? As we get out into parallel development, we need to make sure that our consumers and our producers were working at the same time. Now, of course, those use cases have grown, and with the term service virtualization, some of you might have heard as well, introduced about 10, 12 years ago. The audience of using subbing and mocking has grown outside of just core development use and into quality assurance, and especially load performance and resiliency testing. Now, when you boil it down, what WireMock does is it's a bunch of if-then statements or case statements saying, if this comes in, then send back this response, right? Now, it gets a lot more complicated than that. And we can see what a sample type of hello world example is here. When a request on a GET comes in on the URL of something, we're going to respond back with a 200 and the body of hello world, the various different headers. Now, this approach is slightly different than what some other tools out there. You may have heard of tools like Mockito, just to name one, which is also a stubbing tool, but its use case is more solely in the unit testing side, in that you're changing your source code when you're doing the testing. So this doesn't necessarily apply to regression testing, later stage quality assurance, and performance testing, because we're not testing the production code when we use these object-based and class-based stubbing mechanisms. Where WireMock comes in is actually standing in for those dependent systems, downstream systems, right? As if they are the real thing. So we're not changing any client libraries in our system under test. We're simply just repointing where we're communicating to. This way, we are exercising the true classes and logic inside of our system under test and not changing it and invalidating our tests. Now, as I said, WireMock started as an open source platform, and we had the discussion during the panel briefly about, is open source good enough, or do we really need to look for commercial offerings and pay for those commercial offerings? Well, selfishly, I'm going to say absolutely that we need to, we can get our feet wet, and there's certain use cases for open source, usually much earlier in the software development lifecycle. But as we reach those later stages into full-on integration testing, regression testing, and especially load performance and resiliency testing, we're going to need the additional capabilities that a commercial product like WireMock Cloud offers. So the key differences between the open source version of WireMock and the commercial edition of WireMock called WireMock Cloud are highlighted here, right? First and foremost, it's fully hosted, right? It's a SaaS offering, allowing your teams not to have to support and keep the infrastructure of WireMock up and running. It also layers in a nice graphical user interface in addition to all of the traditional APIs and SDK implementations for using WireMock. This expands greatly the audience of users that can participate in the development and the usage and the creation and updating of these mock APIs, expanding the number of people that can use them and facilitating actually the sharing of them across the organization so that we are not just throwing away these mocks and we're getting great reuse of them across. Of course, we also support unlimited scale, right? When it comes to load and performance testing, resiliency testing, being able to scale up open source, software is often a burden, right? And can be quite costly. With WireMock Cloud, of course, we're doing that all for you. We also introduce chaos testing inside of WireMock Cloud. Again, inside of that load and performance and resiliency testing, we need to ensure that even on the worst days when those third parties are not behaving the way that they should, that our system under test behaves appropriately and can handle that chaos when it happens. And of course, there's a host of other capabilities inside of WireMock Cloud that layer on top of the open source piece. So there's several use cases, and we've talked about some of them, right? So with WireMock Cloud, you're going to get, be able to get more resiliency out of your software, right? You're going to be able to remove those third parties dependency and risks. You're going to be able to, make those third parties, if you will, actually behave the way that you'd expect. I'd referenced the scientific method a little bit earlier, where we should only be changing one thing at a time. That should be our system under test. It shouldn't be the way that the dependent systems actually respond when we send them a request. When we ask for apples, we should get a list of the various different apples back. It shouldn't send back oranges. Now, maybe we wanted to send back oranges to make sure we handle that scenario as well. These are all the types of data scenarios that we can force, aka mock the third party and sending that stuff back to us. It also allows us to be more productive, right? Because now we don't have to wait around. We can start our testing, integration testing a lot earlier. And with the world of Swagger and the open specs, we can get a clear, defined contract of what these systems, how they're going to behave when they're released, and start our testing earlier in the cycle. And then on the other side, usually more applicable to earlier in the life cycle, giving collaborative capabilities, being able to share these mocks around, and then creating a great experience for the customers of our products, right? And teaching them how they can use our products well before we release the next version of them, giving them nice developer portals. Now, on to the dependencies. And I say dependencies a lot because that's really what WireMock is helping our customers solve for, is dependencies in the software development lifecycle, whether you're a developer or you're a tester. And we think about all of the dependencies, and as they grow, we talked a lot about AI today, and during the roundtable I mentioned, our products are now incorporating more and more use of AI dependent services, whether that be Mock GPT, other, um, other language models, right, that we're developing internally. I mean, it goes on. Address validation, there's numerous of, and that introduces a host of issues, right, and all these dependencies, even for testers, right. As I mentioned, APIs are they're reliable, but unreliable, especially those third-party ones, right? Either the testing environment gets shut down at the end of the day, and they're operating on a different business schedule than we are as testers, or they just disappear for no reason in the middle of the day, or whatever data scenarios we had set up in the sandbox of that third party are just wiped out unexpectedly, and now all of our test cases start failing. Right. It's just being reliant on these APIs, internal or external, and making sure that they have the scenarios that we expect to be in there is just a burden to us. And they're often expensive, as I mentioned, right? In especially something like an OpenAI ChatGPT, where you have a finite amount of transactions that you can send to these third parties. That becomes a big challenge in load and performance testing, where we want to do more and continuous load and performance testing, but the budget just doesn't allow for that. And this is a great place where a tool like WireMock can help. And also that chaos piece, asking a third party, asking a dependent service to send back bad data. I think you'll just get a lot of vendors, a lot of teams just saying, no, we won't do that. We can't do that. We don't have the resources to do that. So how in the world do we test effectively our system under test against these rainy day scenarios when this chaos starts to happen? It's another great area for using, WireMock. So, how can WireMock help in all these situations? I'll showcase this in the demo today on how we can actually record the interactions with these dependencies while they are healthy, and then very easily be able to cut that cord to those dependencies, either when it's unhealthy or when we need to generate the data scenarios that aren't supported by those dependent systems. We don't need to reset data, right? Test data management is a headache and a whole problem space on its own. But if we're testing against mocks, we control the data. We reset the data instantaneously. We can performance test more often at higher volumes and also inject that chaos into it as well. So how do we actually, start to make use of this in our test suites and focus this more into, the Katalon community and merging these two worlds together? Well, there's multiple ways that we can facilitate this, right? We can manually create these mock APIs using the WireMock Cloud UI, which I'll show very briefly in a moment. You can use Swagger and Open API specifications from the third parties to create a mock API very rapidly, as this has now become de facto standard when working with APIs and defining them. We can record that traffic, as I mentioned, and I'll showcase in a minute. It wouldn't be surprising if many of your development organizations are already using WireMock open source internally. WireMock Cloud allows the capability to import all of those assets into WireMock Cloud and reuse them and morph them into the exact data scenarios that you need to complete your testing. It can all be automated via the API of WireMock, so you don't need to use the UI to do this, and we can bake this directly into our CI and CD environments and continuous testing environments as well to automate everything I'll show you today. But best yet, we can simply just embed it into our Katalon test suites. So as we see here, right, production ready code. Hopefully the demo gods are with me today, and I'll show you a little bit on what this looks like with the remainder of our time. So first, what I'll do is I'll just open up my tab here and give you a brief overview of what's going on under the hood here with WireMock Cloud. So this is the UI we're looking at. I have an endpoint that's up and running here, Katalon.WireMock API.cloud. And it simply has one matching scenario in here right now. And this is if someone sends a get to users. So we can see this is programmed to be a get to the user's endpoint. It's going to send back a status code of 200, and it's going to send back all these various headers here, as well as a request body that comes down. And to make a change to this is very simple. I can start to change my data scenario, change the ID, and hit save, and my data scenario is up and running. So when this get comes in for this users, that data is changed. Very quick and easy, simple there. Let's actually switch over to Katalon now. Hopefully, a screen that many of you are familiar with here, and showcase how this actually would work to kind of morph these two worlds together. So you'll see in the side here in my object repository, I have a few different transactions. These are REST transactions that have been defined. If I open up one such as here for provisioning a mock, we can see that in order to create that same request that we just saw in the UI, which was that get on the users, this is the body that we're passing to the WireMock API. It's simple. It's a name. We're doing a get on that user's endpoint. It's going to respond back with the 200. And here's the body that's going to come back with, as well as the headers. And simply by sending this to our endpoint, an admin endpoint, we can add this mock to, or this stub to our mock API and be able to respond back to this particular request when it comes in. There's also a better way, or an easier way, right? If we have a live endpoint and we simply, and it's healthy, we can just start to record our traffic. As we can see with this example here, this integration point, we can simply send this little bit of payload to the admin endpoint and recordings, and we can start a recorder. And what I'll showcase here today is we'll use that api.github.com endpoint to record some live traffic that our system under test passes through WireMock Cloud. WireMock Cloud is able to capture that, turn it into a stub, and then we can effectively cut that cord and not have to rely on the real api.github.com. So what does that look like? Let's open up a test case here. In the first one, we'll take a look at provisioning that mock. So we're going to first go ahead and clean up our existing mock. As I showed you, we already had a stub in there. So let's go ahead and clean up after ourselves and get back to a known state. We'll send a get users request to WireMock, and I'll show you how nothing comes back, or the wrong answer comes back because the mock doesn't know how to respond to it anymore. We'll very quickly provision that mock, right? And teach WireMock how to respond to that get users request. And then we'll send it again. And we'll make sure with our send request and verify that the right result is coming back. So we'll go ahead and we'll run this very quickly. And I'll peel up our bottom here so we can see. And overall, we can see our suite has, our test case has failed. Our first request of deleting mappings worked to WireMock. That's fine. And here we can see in our second one where we had our get to the users that our verification has failed. And we can see over here in our root cause that we got a status code of 404 coming back instead of our expected 200. Well, the next step that we did, remember, was we actually taught WireMock now how to respond to that get users request. And then we went ahead and tried sending it one more time. And then this second time of sending that send request and verify to that get users endpoint, which is now WireMock, we have our validation passing perfectly there. So this was a little bit, we knew in this case what our request and response looked like. Remember, that was where we did our provision mock, and we taught WireMock exactly how to respond. Now, this is having to know a little bit more technical, what that interaction between api.github.com looks like, and then being able to convert that into this particular format. We can do one better than that, and we can actually make use of the recording feature inside of our Katalon suites. So while the system is healthy, the dependent system, ChatGPT, API.github.com, whatever it might be, we can record that healthy traffic. And that's what we're doing here. Again, we'll delete our mappings, and then we're going to send a request to GitHub directly. We'll send the same request again to WireMock and show how it fails because it doesn't know how to respond to it. We'll then start that recording. We'll tell WireMock, hey, just start recording the traffic. Pass it on to the real API.github.com. Take note of what it's doing, and then learn from that. So we'll send that request again through WireMock. That'll go to GitHub. We'll stop our recording. And then for the last part, we'll send our transaction of get users directly to WireMock with that cord being cut and not using API.github.com anymore. So as you would expect, if the demo gods are with me, this should all go as according to plan. And if we come down here, we can see overall the suite has failed again. That's simply because, remember, I did a WireMock get users after deleting all of WireMock's knowledge on how to respond to get users. And then ultimately, we started that recording. We then did another get users to WireMock with the recorder active, in which WireMock passed on our transaction to the real GitHub.api, recorded those interactions. Then we said stop recording. This effectively cuts our cord to the real GitHub API. And now when WireMock gets a request for get users, we can see that it's responding appropriately, and our request and verify works as we had expected. And again, if we looked at what this actually generated for this recording inside of WireMock Cloud, we can do a refresh here. We can see, again, our stub has been created here. If we come into our request log, we can see all of those interactions that we had before. So here's when we cleaned up our mock and deleted the get user stub from WireMock, it no longer knew how to respond to it. So the way WireMock responded was with a 404 and saying we have no stub mappings yet. Then we turned on the recorder and a request came through. And even though it's a compressed payload, WireMock knew how to uncompress that and turn that into a valid stub. And then ultimately, after we cut that cord by stopping the recorder, this is what WireMock saw. It saw a request to get users. And then it responded back with our status 200, with all of the headers that it had recorded when we had that recording turn on, as well as the full payload. And we can see now in plain text how WireMock responded. So some key takeaways from what we saw here, right? API dependencies in our software will continue to grow. I think we all know that. And those are more and more going to rely on both internal and external AI endpoints and every other type of API that you can imagine, whether they're microservices or third party. Hopefully you're seeing that mocks, right, aren't only useful to the developers and their unit testing, and while they're hammering on the keyboard trying to get our software to work in the way that we'd expect it to do, but they can be very helpful in solving for all of those dependencies that we have as we reach quality assurance and performance engineering. And the object level mocking, right? Again, tools like Mockito and several others that are out there are not suitable really past unit testing because they replace the actual code inside of our system under test. And we're not exercising the true libraries that will be used in production. Hopefully you also saw that WireMock is easy to use, both in a standalone mode where we can click in the UI if we're comfortable with that to create the scenarios that we need, or if you're going to integrate it into Katalon. And best of all, WireMock Cloud Personal Edition is completely free, right? So if you go to wiremock.io, you'll have the opportunity to use it and have it available to you for all of your needs for an indefinite amount of time.